Perfect. Good afternoon, everybody. We've got Ella. Ella, can you hear us?
Yes, I'm here.
Hi, Ella. And I see Erin has joined us.
Hi.
Hi, Erin. And in the room, Dr. Hubert Wong and Dan Angel here from the support unit, the communication specialist at the support unit. And we are just waiting for one more participant who will be joining us, and that's Thalia. So with your permission, can we wait just one more minute? Hearing no. Yeah. Okay, then there could be two more. That's a possibility. So we'll just wait one more minute if that's okay. And where's our PowerPoint? I'm just going to move to, can you see our screen, Erin?
No. Let me go back.
Okay. So share screen. How does that look now?
I can see it.
Okay, excellent. Thank you, Ella.
Okay, don't worry about me. I'm just going to go into my settings here and fiddle, okay?
Okay. So given that we are recording this, for those that, even though this was for people who are unable to actually attend the planning event, people who are actually unable to attend this event as well, we will have this recorded, or if they're a little late joining. So I'm thinking now we're a few minutes past time. And given what we'd like to cover today, with your permission, then we'll get started, and whoever joins us later can catch up the first few minutes from as we move along. So let me just move to the slideshow. And thank you for joining us today, those that were able to join us in real time, as well as those who will be able to access this later in the recorded version. This is for the Real World Clinical Trials Methods Cluster of the Support Unit, and the purpose of this webinar is to enable those who were unable to attend the actual planning event, which was hosted on September 11th, to get a good sense of what was covered at that event, and to share their thoughts about what we share with them about what was covered at the event. So we'd like to welcome you. Hubert, would you like to say a few words first?
Actually, I'm just wondering, should we get introductions from the others as well?
We were going to, yeah.
Okay, all right. So thank you guys for attending this webinar. I hope that at the end of it, that you'll at least have a flavor of what was covered in the whole day on September 11th. And in particular, I hope that you'll have some ideas to share as to how you would like to be involved in this cluster.
Thank you, Hubert. And that's my less than ideal photo there. I'm Alison Hoens, and I'm the KT specialist for the Methods Cluster, and I welcome this opportunity to speak with you. I'd like to hear more, though, about who you are, where you're from, and your interest in the Real World Clinical Trials Methods Cluster. Ella, would you like to go first?
Yeah, sure. Love to. I guess given that my portfolio is the CST SPORE Data Analytics Project Manager, means that part of my job is to ensure that the CST Cerner data is going to be consumable for researchers. And in my mind,
I'm thinking I should be out too.
Sorry? Sorry, did someone say something?
No, that's was that Ella who was just speaking about your role?
Yes.
Yes, please go ahead, Ella, and then we will go do the round table with the people that just joined us.
Oh, okay. Yeah, so my job, as I was saying, is to make the CST Cerner data consumable for researchers. And in my mind, you know, I'm trying to define researcher very, very broadly. And in fact, I'm trying to use more the term secondary user.
Yep.
And so in my mind, part of the researcher community are the folks doing clinical trials. And so just wanting to be sure I understand as much as possible what's going on in, excuse me, in that space, what those folks are going to need, what they want in terms of access to Cerner data.
Okay, thank you, Ella. Hubert, did you have any questions to Ella before we continue doing the rounds?
No, I think we can keep going.
Okay. Erin, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. I'm Erin Mahalik. I'm the Methods Cluster Lead for Patient Engagement, fairly newly minted over the last few weeks, which is why I didn't meet the first live version of the Real World Clinical Trial meeting, but it's great to be with you today. So, of course, I'm particularly interested in the learnings from the methods clusters who have gone ahead of me in these events, in contributing and learning more about patient engagement in real-world clinical trials. And then, more personally, I conduct RCTs. I'm not sure whether they're real-world or not, but I expect to know the answer of that by the end of today's meeting.
Thank you, Erin. Andrea, I saw that you were online briefly with us. Are you still there? No. And have we missed anybody else online?
I might be hiding in the background, but it's Kent here.
Hi, Kent. Would you like to introduce yourself, Kent?
Well, if that seems to be the obligatory order of business, I can do so. I am Kent Loftsgaard. I've been a patient partner with the support unit for about as long as there's been a support unit to support, which in my case is about 16 months now. And I was not able to attend the real-world clinical trials planning day because my home cloning machine is still dysfunctional, and I was not able to be in two places at once. And the other place that I was required to be that particular day was in my role as a clinical educator with Vancouver Coastal Health.
Thank you for joining us today, Kent. Is there anyone else on the line that we haven't had the opportunity to hear from?
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Patricia DeMarco. I work with Hoffman LaRoche in our evidence generation department here in Canada. And I'm really just interested to hear how patient-focused research is being done across Canada and how, as a pharmaceutical company, Roche can change our ways in adapting and developing research within the Canadian marketplace.
Thank you for joining us, Patricia. Is there anybody else on the line?
So I'll jump in, maybe. My name is Mal. Sorry, my name is Mal Kaminska. I'm an assistant professor at the University of Northern British Columbia. My area of interest and expertise is medical education, but understood more broadly, it also applies to the education of patients. I'm also a family physician, and so some of my clinical research definitely involves patients. And so I'm here kind of like Patricia, not from the pharmaceutical perspective, but just to understand better what's happening out there and how I would fit into this new world.
Thank you for joining us, Mal. Have we missed anybody? Anyone who hasn't had a chance to introduce themselves? Okay, hearing none, we're going to move now into the content of this session. So we've been through some introductions. Our objectives for today are to enable those who are unable to attend the planning event to hear the messages that were shared, both to and from participants, and also to enable an opportunity for yourselves to provide some input in regards to what resonates with you from what you hear and what you would like to add to what's already being shared with the methods cluster. So really, we had 3 objectives at the planning event. The first was to establish a foundation so everybody understood what patient-oriented research, how it's defined here at the support unit, what a methods cluster is, what methods are, and what's the distinction between a real-world clinical trial and a non-real-world clinical trial. And then to initiate discussion for a shared vision. And specifically, that was to identify key components of a real-world clinical trial which would be appropriate for methods development by the cluster, and to explore the feasibility of and potential required resources for projects in methods development in real-world clinical trials. And thirdly, to stimulate the development of a community that would contribute to the cluster. So both the content and the format of the planning event were based on achieving these 3 objectives. So really, who was there? We had a community wall. We had bios. Everybody could submit their bio, and if you would, this is the clusters are sort of an organic, living entity. So if from what you hear today, oh, thank you for joining us, Thalia. We're just partway through the presentation. We've just done a few slides. But Thalia, maybe before I go on, you can just introduce yourself. Or you might be on mute, Thalia. That's okay. When you have an opportunity, feel free to either write in the chat box or to stop and introduce yourself. So we're just saying about who was at the planning event. So there were patient partners, researchers, healthcare providers, healthcare decision makers. How did they get there? Well, first of all, we had an open call in the newsletter where we let people know that this planning event was happening, and they could let us know if they were interested in attending. We also targeted the call to research settings throughout BC, on the island, in the north, in the interior, as well as here in the Lower Mainland. And we also asked people to snowball, to please send the open call to their colleagues that they thought it might be appropriate for. So there was some targeting, but the targeting was only to enable an opportunity to identify people that we might not already be familiar with. We had space for just under 40 people at the event, and because of that, we needed to have a way of helping to identify whose voices, to ensure that we had geographical distribution, we had distribution from different stakeholder groups, etc. So the process that enabled it is after the call, we had an expression of interest where we asked people to fill out a short survey online with where they're from, what their interest in real-world clinical trials were, what they saw as the current strengths and gaps in BC, and what they would like to see from the planning day. That helped us to identify and make sure that we got good representation from all the different stakeholder groups as well as different regions. Are there any questions about this?
Nope.
Okay. We recognize that that couldn't possibly capture everybody, and hence here's the purpose of today, so that those that couldn't be in the room could hear and then contribute to the cluster. So we asked in that initial expression of interest and survey, one of the first questions we asked was, what are your desired outcomes of the event? And people said they first of all, wanted to understand what a real-world clinical trial was and wasn't, to understand what the problems would be, the important problems to address, and what was possible and feasible, to get a sense of how they could contribute, to engage with others, to enable collaboration, and to really get better clarity on the direction of the real-world clinical trials methods cluster. So that led to the question, what is a cluster and who is a member of it? Well, we don't really have a criteria. We don't have a passing test that you have to be a member of the cluster. It includes all stakeholder groups, as you can see, patient partners, researchers, decision makers, and those are the categories that are given by CIHR. But Hubert, would you like to add the additional subcategories that are relevant in the real-world clinical trials language?
Yeah, well, I guess being a methods cluster, the focus is going to be on developing methods research. So the large part of the stakeholder group consists of people who are doing methods research. So that involves like biostatisticians, health economists, knowledge translation, methodologists, basically anyone who's interested in how to develop better ways to do research, not about a specific project, but the approach that we take.
Any questions at this point? We're going to get into a definition shortly of the distinction of real-world clinical trials and of the methods cluster, but we just wanted to conceptualize, or really make it clear what that there's no criteria for being a part of the methods cluster. Okay, hearing none, we'll move on. So the first thing that people said in the survey is they wanted to make sure we had a shared foundation of these definitions. So the first thing is, what is patient-oriented research? And within the support unit and CIHR and SPORE more broadly, there's 4 criteria. It engages patients as partners throughout the entire continuum, from identifying the questions to prioritizing the questions, to be undertaken in conjunction with multidisciplinary teams, and then to apply the knowledge generated to improve the healthcare system and practices. So this always begets the question, do all 4 criteria have to be met in order to be patient-oriented research? And the simplest answer is ideally. But in the real world, it might not be possible to meet all 4 criteria simultaneously. The key concepts are co-development and co-use. We also took the opportunity to explain what SPORE is and what the support units are. And SPORE is the overall initiative, which is a coalition, federal, provincial, and territorial, to assist with the integration of research into care. As you can see, there's 5 elements of SPORE. The support units are just one of the 5 elements. And the support is an acronym for support for patient and public-oriented research and trials. People wanted to understand a little bit about how the support unit is organized. And what you see is that we have a distributed model here. We have 5 centers located in different regions of BC so that we ensure that we're as close as feasible to delivering service in different regions of the province. And the Vancouver Center duplicates as a hub. What's most relevant in this picture is that these regional centers are the core structure of service delivery, of supporting the practice and patient-oriented research. So if you're a researcher like Mal, who says, I've got a project and I want to submit for a CIHR grant that involves patient-oriented research, but I need some help for KT, or I need some help for patient engagement, or for something like that, then it's the regional centers that would help to provide you with the linkage to get those partnerships to enable it. So they're the service delivery side. In contrast, the methods cluster are really the science side of the support unit. And as you can see there, we have a number. We have KT, Knowledge Translation and Implementation Science, Data Science and Health Informatics, Real-World Clinical Trials, patient engagement, and health economics and simulation modeling. Now, the purpose of these methods clusters is to study and to advance the science in the methods of patient-oriented research. And we'll get into a little bit more detail later. Any questions? No? I see we've had a couple more people join us. If you haven't had the opportunity to introduce yourself and would like to, we would love to hear from you. So for the people that have just joined, do you mind saying your name?
Hi, it's Thalia Field. I'm a stroke neurologist and clinical trialist at UBC. I was unable to make the forum last month, but pleased to be participating.
Thank you, Thalia. Is there anybody else who hasn't had an opportunity? Okay, so moving on then, what you see in this diagram is just a very general pictorial representation. You see that those service centers, those regional centers are in the middle there, and they deliver the services. The methods clusters surround that as they are involved in advancing the science, and obviously the knowledge that's generated from the methods clusters can then be used in the service delivery. We then have a number of funding and partner organizations that support and deliver services. And then there's 2 demonstration projects funded by CIHR, which are a part of the support unit, but not fully within the support unit. They existed prior to the support unit development. And a number of networks that are supported by CIHR, such as CanSolve, the Kidney Disease Network, and Child Bright. So that just is a quick pictorial representation. Our partners are fundamental in delivering service and in helping to create the infrastructure that we need in order to meet our mandate within the support unit. And you can see probably a number of logos here of organizations and partners that you are already familiar with. So, for example, Ellen, you can see that CFT is one of our partners in the endeavors of the support unit. So as I wrap up here, the methods clusters are the primary science pillars. The mandate is to advance the evidence base of scientific methods used within the context of patient-oriented research by fostering a community of methodologists with relevant stakeholders to engage in discussions and collaboratively undertake projects. So the main mechanism by which the methods clusters will work is to collectively identify projects and undertake those projects that advance the science in method. So 3 main goals: to advance the science, to promote the use of the knowledge that's generated, and then to promote the field of research of that particular methods cluster. So just to make it clear, if you need support for particular projects, you click on the green button on our webpage, which takes you to the inquiry form that helps align you with the supports that you need for your research project. The methods clusters themselves do not directly support the teams that are undertaking their own research projects. Instead, it's about collaborative projects only for methods development. So I'm going to pass over to Hubert now to walk you through the other really important definitions that are far more meaningful than what I've just gone through.
Oh, I don't know about that. Just to elaborate on one point that Alison just finished with regarding support for projects, it is possible that there will be overlap between service delivery and the methods cluster, in the sense that some of these projects that come in may involve novel elements and require methods which have not yet been developed. And if that were the case, then the support unit would direct those inquiries to the methods cluster to take a look at that. So there isn't a complete wall between service delivery and methods, but generally the idea is that the methods are meant to produce results which are generally applicable, not specific to a particular project. Now, why was this cluster called the real-world clinical trials cluster rather than just a clinical trials cluster? And that has to do mainly with this notion of trying to make research more patient-oriented. Okay? Now, if you think about how the sort of typical clinical trial proceeds, well, we usually have a trial sponsor who's interested in the efficacy of some intervention. And the goal is really to show that this intervention works. And so in order to show that it works, they will typically try to pick a subgroup of patients in whom they think there is the greatest chance of it working. So it's a very narrow patient population that they conduct the study in. Again, often because it's a novel agent, they want to conduct this in a very well-controlled setting to sort of minimize the sort of noise that comes in from uncontrolled factors. And so they'll, in conjunction with that, often these interventions are being delivered by people who are sort of experts with respect to that intervention. Okay. The patients will undergo very close monitoring during the study. And often at the end of the day, what they hope to see is that efficacy is shown on one primary outcome, often clinical. Okay. Now, in contrast, a real-world clinical trial attempts to see how well interventions work in the real world. And in the real world, we don't restrict interventions to narrowly defined populations. We try to include as many people as possible, or maybe we have no choice but to involve broad patient populations. These interventions are usually delivered in usual care settings where you're not following these patients out very closely. Okay. There's lots of external factors that could affect outcomes. And what, in the spirit of patient-oriented research, we would also like these trials to evaluate outcomes that are important to patients, which not necessarily involves just one primary clinical outcome. Okay. Are there questions about that? No? All right. Right. So what do we mean by clinical trial methodology? Okay, well, clinical methodology represents the procedures that we use to, now I'm just going to move this other way here. These are procedures used to minimize the bias in the results, to maximize efficiency, and to enhance the generalizability and value of the trial. And so methodology can involve any part of the clinical trial life cycle, from planning to execution through analysis and dissemination. And so I've listed on a slide some examples of different things that involve methodology, and I won't go through them. But I'll just move forward. Let's see what's going on.
We have to click on the screen first and then try.
Okay, all right. Right. So what will the real-world clinical trials methods cluster do? Okay. So what we are hoping to do is to develop a community of methodologists supported by relevant stakeholders. That includes the patient partners, clinical trialists, decision makers, to collectively develop and test methods that will enhance the feasibility, efficiency, generalizability, and value of clinical trials. So at this stage, we are not proposing specific projects. What we are trying to do is bring together people who have an interest in this and who have ideas about what we can do. Okay. Now, what sorts of things might we do? So here's a list of things. We're not saying that these are what we will undertake, but these are just ideas for people to think about. Okay. So an example might be identifying optimal individualized therapies that take into account both clinical and patient-reported outcomes. Okay. And so the idea here is that, again, if you think about the classical clinical trial, at the end of the day, there's often a conclusion that's made. A is better than B, or A is not better than B, or B is better than A. It kind of ignores the fact that in many circumstances, whether or not A is better than B depends on the individual and what the individual's values are. Okay. And so what we would like to do in this cluster is to come up with ways that we can tease out those situations where A might be better, or B might be better than A for this individual, while A might be better than B for another individual. Okay. We're also, or within the scope of this cluster is also methods that will improve trial processes, such as consenting patients. You know, is there some way that we can consent patients which will enhance the value of the trial? Okay. A third possibility is that we will develop statistical methods that will address limitations imposed by real-world constraints. So a very simple example would be that in many situations, it's not practical to randomize an individual to one intervention or the other because this intervention maybe needs to be delivered to groups. Okay. For example, if it's an intervention that involves training medical staff at a center, every patient at that center is going to receive the same treatment. Okay. And that poses special statistical problems. And so that's a fairly simple problem. People have looked at that, but there are other situations that are much more complex, and we need to develop appropriate statistical methodology for it. Okay. And finally, another example of something we might do is to try to leverage external information and patient preferences when we're designing our trials, and also when we are analyzing our trial results, so that, again, patients and policymakers can make better decisions that involve not just the information that arises from the trial itself, but from external knowledge, from other trials, from observational studies, from, again, patient priorities. Okay. All right. And are there any other questions or comments at this point? All right, then we'll move on. Now, what is outside the scope of the cluster? We will not worry about things or not work on things like administrative issues that are necessary to conducting trials. We will not look at issues like regulatory requirements or review processes, recognizing that these are important processes that every trial must go through, and that as we do work in this cluster, we will have to be cognizant of sort of the restrictions and constraints that are placed on us by these requirements, but we'll also attempt to liaise with the appropriate groups to inform them about how they could help us to better conduct real-world trials.
So yeah, I guess the take-home message here is that we'll work with the methods cluster. Obviously, can't work in isolation of these areas, but it wouldn't be the focus of the work of the methods clusters.
Thank you all. All right. Let's see. Right. Okay. So, what? Just.
Do you want me to?
Yeah.
Sure. So now we'd like to just cover basically what we went through, how we worked together with the participants at the planning event. And this was our agenda. We started with, where are we now, the present state? And that was the results of the survey, which Hubert will go through just the key highlights in a moment. Then we had a speaker from Toronto, and we'll hit the key messages about perspectives to consider for this cluster. And then we broke into small groups for 2 activities in the afternoon. What are the areas that are important to address, and what is feasible to address? So if we start with the results from the survey, so this is the pre-workshop, the pre-planning event survey.
So altogether there were 31 respondents, and at the planning events, 23 of these 31 individuals were in attendance. As you can see, a large proportion of them, roughly half of these respondents, were methodologists. So these are the statisticians, the health economists, people who develop methods. Okay, there were a number of people who would be classified as trial support providers. So these are research managers, trial coordinators, and et cetera, people who are on the front lines of conducting the trial. There were 5 trial investigators, mainly clinicians who conduct research, and several others in areas not connected specifically to clinical trials. Other attendees were our patient partners, a Ministry of Health representative, and leaders from the support unit. So what did these respondents identify as gaps in real-world clinical trials in BC? At the top of this list was the lack of consideration of individualized treatment. So earlier I talked about how A might be better than B for one individual, while B might be better than A for another individual. And so there currently is not a lot of work that's been done in how do we address this issue in a clinical trial. There were some concerns about lack of engagement and training of stakeholders. Okay. So in some cases, people are wondering who are the stakeholders that we even need to engage. Okay. There was a concern that the classical clinical trial is not very generalizable to the real world, so that's just, again, motivation for why we want to look at real world clinical trials. Okay. And there was a concern that there's a lack of resources, both in terms of infrastructure and expertise to conduct real world clinical trials. What did people think were strengths in real world clinical trials? The top one here was expertise. So people felt that we have a lot of people who are capable of undertaking this work, and there was a sense that people are very willing to collaborate. Okay. And closely following that was there's a belief that we have very good data sources, okay. Population data, clinical information systems that are, well, increasingly becoming available to answer questions that administrative data cannot. And the last theme was that there is support from organizational structures for this cluster to undertake its work. What did people want from the planning event? The top ones were a better understanding of real-world clinical trials, collaboration opportunities, some notion of what represents real-world clinical trial methodology, and where this cluster is going. Right. So at the event, our main speaker was an individual by the name of Robert Reinhardt. He's been a long-time community activist in the area of HIV/AIDS, and I've served with him on various committees. And so he is both, he was here as a patient partner, but he also has considerable experience as a community researcher himself. And so he was here to talk to us about what it would take for real-world clinical trials to truly have patient-oriented research focus. Okay. And so he spoke for roughly an hour, and so we don't have time to go through everything, but these were sort of the summary points that he had on his last slides here. Okay. And I think sort of the takeaway message from him was that, first of all, clinical trials, well, all clinical trials should be real-world clinical trials. Conducting these sorts of trials requires a huge collaborative effort from all stakeholders, not just from one group.
So then after Robert's presentation, we asked our participants to scope out on the wall with Post-it notes, things they found of particular value in what Robert had shared with us, and what concerns were raised from the presentation. The things that the cluster would be of particular importance to incorporate or to be concerned about as we move ahead with the work of the cluster. And you can see those points here. By the way, if you are interested in a copy, a PDF of these slides, please feel free to contact me, contact the support unit or myself, Hoens at BC Support Unit. You'll see our email at the end, and I'm happy to share a copy of these slides. But in the interest of time, because we do want to hear from you, I'm not going to read every word on the slides. So what we did after Robert's presentation then was, okay, how do we move from the present? If this is the current state, both from the results of the survey, as well as from someone who's lived in this world and crossing worlds over a period of time, how do we get to the future? So we wanted to, first of all, take time within the groups, people representing different stakeholders, to look at what opportunities might exist within real-world clinical trials in all three phases. So when Hubert showed you that slide of the different things like recruiting, consenting, all the different parts of planning, of execution and analysis and dissemination, could we identify opportunities within each of the three phases for methods development? So that objective, that purpose was to identify the key components, to look at broad themes and specific goals, and how could we work collaboratively to achieve those. And this is what the participants shared with us from that.
Right, so there were a lot of ideas, but what we tried to do at the end was to distill it down to the key ones that people seemed to latch onto most often. And so the four ideas here are, first of all, leveraging information from health databases. So that's using the provincial data platform, but then building on to that with registry data, electronic medical records, and so on, and to assist with the various parts of the trial where data is needed, such as identifying eligible patients, capturing baseline values, and also outcomes. Okay, so one of the focuses of real-world clinical trials is to attempt to be more efficient, and what could be more efficient if you get your outcome out of a data set that's already being collected rather than going out and spending money to collect it on your own. The second key point was that we will need to develop core outcome sets that capture patient priorities. So currently, each trial is developed where the set of outcomes that's collected is sort of selected, but often by the trial investigator, and maybe not enough consideration is given into what the patients think are important. We will need to develop methods that will enable patients to make decisions that are right for herself or himself. And we'll also have to develop methods to allow us to evaluate not just the efficacy of an intervention, but its effectiveness in large populations. And also, we have to evaluate whether the method by which we implement an intervention impacts on the value of an intervention.
So after that, if those were the 4 global areas, themes under which projects could be identified, the next thing was to look at how feasible those might be. So the questions that we asked each of the small working groups to address were, okay, well, what resources would be required? What issues would affect the feasibility of each? Who else would need to be involved that's not currently in the room? And how would we know if we've been successful in addressing that? And this is what our participants shared with us.
Okay, so I think the dominating theme to all this is that to effectively conduct any of this work, we need involvement and buy-in of all the different stakeholders. Okay, so from the ministry, we would need to have access to real-time data. We would have to, or we would hope to get core outcome sets built into the databases so that this isn't done piecemeal, but is going to be available going forward at large scale. From our patient partners, we need to know what outcomes are priorities for them. We might be asking them to contribute data directly where it's not available through the databases. From our methodologists, we need them to develop efficient and valid methods. And from our clinicians, what are the potential interventions that we should be testing? And what are the limitations that we need to take into consideration when we're trying to evaluate those interventions? Okay. From people like the research ethics boards, we're going to have to work with them to address issues that are going to arise in real-world trials, which don't arise in classical trials. And so basically, I think the dominating theme was we all need to work together on this.
Okay, so what we've tried to give in these last, in the slides here, well, sorry, before we move on to that, we also then asked our participants to do a post-event survey because we have a responsibility to evaluate the activities that we undertake. We had about a 50% response rate, and 2 of the questions, other than asking people to rank if we felt that we met those 3 objectives that we outlined on the initial slide, we also asked them to articulate if they felt excited about anything from the day, or was there something that they were concerned about in regards to the cluster. In response to what they felt excited about, overwhelmingly the dominant theme was that they felt that there was really very clear feeling that we could work collaboratively. So as opposed to traditional calls for a grant application where it's competitive, that this model, the methods cluster model, is a great opportunity to move forward, to work collaboratively rather than competitively for a project moving forward. And as far as things that people were concerned about, not surprisingly, they said, well, you know, we haven't seen this before. There's no model to work from. There's no template. So we're not sure how it's going to work. We want to see what the finished product will be. And we need to create a system. You know, how can we break down the pieces into different stages? So, you know, this was just the first step in the development of the methods cluster. So what we'd like to do now is for us to be quiet, and I'm going to do a little round table in the interest of time for you to express your thoughts and just share your ideas about what resonates, what additional ideas, and recognizing that we don't have a lot of time in this webinar, but that, you know, afterwards, please feel free to communicate with us, and our email addresses are here at the end of this slideshow to hear your thoughts. So let's go around the table. First of all, Ellen, do you have any comments as far as what resonates or what additional ideas you might have?
Hi there. Sorry, just took me a minute to get off of mute. Yeah, wow, those are big. I have to admit, there's nothing specific coming to mind right at the moment.
Sure.
Really, I think it's once we get more into the weeds of what's needed and wanted that I'll probably have more to ask and say and that kind of thing.
Okay, thank you, Ellen. Mal, did you want to make any comments?
I'm kind of in the same boat. I think it all sounds great, but as I've noticed, one of the post-survey person was commenting, they're anxious to see how it all comes together. And so that's kind of where I'm at too. I appreciate the concept and principle, but I'm waiting to see how it actually is put into real life action.
Yeah, and that's fair comment, as I mentioned, because there hasn't been, you know, we have a number of clusters that are as you can see, we have the 5 clusters. The Knowledge Translation and Implementation Science was the first one launched. And we're now at the stage of not only have we identified the themes, but we've identified projects, and now there's leadership and collaboration on each of those projects. So, you know, things are starting to take shape, but as we know in the research world, it takes a period of time before you see the actual product at the end. Patricia, do you have any comments?
Not a lot, but I think it's very exciting, and I'm very happy to hear that patient centricity is really moving forward in Canada. I guess from an industry standpoint, I'd like to see how, as industry does play a big part of clinical trials within the Canadian space, especially from a regulatory perspective, how we could ensure that we're focusing on the patient as well, and how we can see the methods you develop can be in turn brought in at earlier stages of product development.
Do you have any comments, Hubert, about that? No? Okay. Thalia, would you like to make any comments?
I think, like everyone, I also am excited to see about how we move forward with the initiative together. I mean, from the lens of someone who's trying to go forward with a trial on a rare disease, I'm particularly interested in methods that we can use to engage kind of non-traditional clinical research sites, as well as how we integrate patient outcomes and patient-oriented information and feedback into our research methodology and research questions.
Thank you, Thalia. Kent.
There we go. I just needed a second to get myself off of mute. Similar in some ways to what Thalia just said. I personally am interested in seeing how this methods cluster can go forward in maybe having some sort of a hand in improving the capture of PREMs and PROMs in this area, patient-reported experiences and outcomes, because I think in the area of clinical trials, you know, historically maybe we haven't done as well as that as we might have. Other than that, more generally, because my interest tends to be so kind of agnostically broad, I'm just allowing each of these methods clusters to vie for the best of my attention.
Thank you, Kent. And we do have good news. You might have seen that we did put the call out for a new cluster lead in patient-centered measurement. So PREMs and PROMs will not that it's devoid from any of the other clusters, and there's a lot of inter-cluster relevant material, but that will play be a particular importance for that methods cluster. Indeed. Erin, do you have any comments?
Just to jump in on the PRIMS or PROMs or PROS piece, depending on which acronym you want to use. It really speaks to feasibility a lot, doesn't it? When you think, so in my field in mental health trials where it's wonderful. We're starting to see for the first time trials being powered, that is, they're figuring out how many participants are needed in the study on the basis of, say, quality of life outcome measures rather than, or sometimes as a primary outcome measure now, rather than a focus on symptoms or relapse rates into a particular condition. It's wonderful, but it's also quite expensive. They often need to be bigger to get the measurement outcomes that you're looking for. And I think key to this is that three parts. One is the feasibility of that. Second is close liaison and partnership with industry. And third is also thinking about our funding organizations and the need to tell the narrative, the importance around that. And probably the power of that narrative comes with patient voices and the kind of fine-grained information you can only get from mixing up methods by talking to patients or participants who are part of that process about what they value and the impact of that. So collecting that piece, but then also thinking about, from, say, an industry perspective or from a clinician's perspective, are there real-world impacts on that, on things that are critical, like adherence rates or tolerance to a particular intervention? So I think that this mixing up of methods that's being proposed here is the only way to answer these messy questions. It's going to be a lot of hard work, but it's critical and really, really important. And the other thing I would just say is that we're not the first to do this. I'll be really eager to hear more about how we'll be learning from organizations like PCORI in the US, or groups that have really been doing a lot of concerted work in this area as well, and how we can take learnings nationally and internationally and feed them into the process, so as you say, we're not reinventing the wheel.
Thank you, and Erin, that was brought up quite resoundingly at this methods cluster planning event, and that was Robert Reinhardt in particular, the speaker, has tremendous experience with PCORI. So the idea is not to reinvent the wheel, but to pick up on the keys. I'm just looking at the timing. We just have about 3 minutes left. So we wanted to give you a sense of what's happening next. So.
Right. So what we're going to do is, after this webinar, create a summary to really try and get to the heart of what people were thinking, both at that planning event and what you guys have said here, and maybe to come up with sort of a list of potential themes where work could be undertaken, along with some examples of projects within those themes, those specific projects. And then we'll be asking people to comment on whether or not there are other projects, specific projects, that they think would be worthwhile to add to the list. And then we'll ask people to respond with their interest in whether they would like to be a leader in developing a particular project, not the leader, but to collaborate in working on it, or just to be kept informed of each project. And based on that information, we'll go forward with developing a work plan for the cluster.
So there's 1 minute left. So here are the key contacts for both Hubert and myself. So we recognize that probably for almost all of you, this might be the first time that you've had an opportunity to get an idea of the concept of the real-world clinical trials methods cluster. We've been as transparent. We are very transparent and intend to continue to be with all our stakeholders. So that's why we shared even the comments about what people's concerns were for the cluster. We ask you to think about what was shared today, and we will share that summary of the workshop and the ideas, and we'll be looking for people to take leadership, to collaborate, or to want to remain to be informed, as Hubert has said from the last slide. So thank you for spending this hour with us, and we look forward to continue to work with you. It's not the end, just the beginning. So thank you all.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Exit here and still maintain the recording.
Yeah, I'm going to record it. On the bottom right.
Yeah.
No, bottom right.
Oh, I see.